Hey guys.
Hello, everyone.
How's everybody doing? Well, it's fun to be here. Jason and I have been colleagues for many, many years. And just to make sure everybody knows, Jason Rubin is the VP of Content for Oculus. I'm Ted Price, founder and CEO of Insomniac Games. And today what we're going to do is Jason's going to talk a lot about where Oculus is today and explain his vision of VR. I'm going to talk a little bit about something special that we're doing with VR in Stormland. We're going to be answering questions that are posted online and also be answering questions from the audience. Okay?
Right. So if you're in Facebook, that's where you submit the questions if you're in the home audience. So go to Facebook, watch us there, and give us the questions.
All right, so let's talk about Oculus and what VR is.
So I always like to level set. It's been about 2 years almost, or 18 months since Touch has been out, which is our hand track controllers. It's been 2 years since we launched the Rift. So high-end 6 degree of freedom VR gaming is 2 years old, basically. And up until now, most of the challenge we've had is filling a store with stuff, things to do. If you're an FPS player, we want to have an FPS. If you're an RPG player, we want to have an RPG. These things are hard to do when you have brand new dev kits and you don't have a lot of time. So we've spent a lot of time making a lot of stuff, but that stuff hasn't been incredibly big and incredibly deep as people are now used to playing on consoles and PC. So we're now entering the second generation, to me, of content at Oculus, where we have had the time to spend to make these titles bigger and deeper. And again, you know, it's 2 years that the Rift's been on the market. You've probably had dev kits for 3. A lot of the things you're seeing shown at the show today were started about 3 years ago, right? This is about the time where a 3-year product starts showing up. So that's kind of what we're entering into. The next generation of bigger, deeper titles, we think will be a lot closer to that rich game experience that the bigger, older gaming devices, so to speak, will have had. And we think VR is absolutely taking its next step towards the future. And one of those titles is Stormland, which you announced a few days ago.
Right. We actually showed off a gameplay trailer, which showed a lot of what you can do in Stormland. Stormland is a free-roaming action-adventure, which takes place on a different world where you play the part of an android. He's actually a gardener for this mysterious world and has been partially destroyed by a malevolent force. And his job is to journey up into what we call the Stormland, which is this sort of ethereal place. And you can see it on the screen right now, where you can do what we call slipstreaming across the clouds in this interesting version of flying. And what I really love about developing this game is anything you can see, you can climb, you can traverse. And our goal with this game was, as Jason's saying, to go bigger, to actually really open things up for VR players and present a game that's not just taking place in a small environment, but that challenges you in terms of traversal, in terms of combat, in terms of what you're scavenging out in the environment. And there's a story that goes along with it. It's got cooperative play as well. But just going back to what Jason was saying about how VR is evolving, we've learned a lot in terms of how to design for the VR audience with our first 3 titles. Right. And it's coming through in what we can do now for the platform.
And I remember when I first came to Insomniac to talk about VR, you said, I've got the perfect game for VR. And I was like, okay, show me. And this was already, Stormland was already a prototype, right? There already existed, there was not a robot hero, if I remember correctly.
Right.
But the cloudscape, the islands, the things that we're seeing in this video mostly existed. And that would have been 3 years ago or more.
Yeah.
And I think I remember saying, this is awesome, way too big for the first generation of VR. It's going to take you too long. It's going to be too cumbersome. You don't know how traversal should work yet. Yeah. We're just learning how locomotion and picking something up and all of these things in VR are going to work. And here we are now 3 some odd years later, and here it is, right?
Well, yeah, you're right. And we didn't know how traversal worked. I think that when we began diving in, we assumed that we could design games the same way we've been designing them for the last almost 25 years. We figured level layouts would be the same. We figured gunplay would be the same. And it totally isn't. If you guys, I'm assuming some of you in this audience are VR players, you know that when you're moving around, things are different. Your head is the camera, right? It's not, we can't move the camera for you. And those are just simple things that we had to learn to walk before we could run, I guess, is sort of the analogy.
Exactly. Yeah. And from Edge of Nowhere, your first title, which was a character action game, that we had to figure out how to get that to work without having the camera fly all over the place, third person, to Feral Rights, and then which was our next step. Then on to Unspoken, which was the first person thing you had done in VR, but we made a very big decision there not to locomote, remember, to warp around, because we weren't confident that we could get Locomotion to work comfortably and easily. And now you're climbing mountains and jumping all over the place, and everything's just kind of working, and there are all these tricks that we're pulling to make it comfortable for people to do that. It's amazing how far we've come in really 3 short years, right?
And I think a lot of that does have to do with more adoption of VR and more acclimatization of players who have been in games that are experimenting with how traversal locomotion should work. And that's pretty exciting. I mean, very, very rarely, I think, do developers get to be on the ground floor of new tech, sort of a new design paradigm. And I know at Insomniac, that's been awesome.
Yeah.
Because we've been designing console games for so long, and now to have something that's totally different that makes us think orthogonally is inspiring.
Well, yeah, when I was doing Crash and you were doing Spyro, which is now 20 plus years ago, our hair was less gray, and we were figuring out how to make character action work in 3D, and every single step we took was difficult because we had only Mario and Sonic and Donkey Kong Country, name your favorite 2D side-scrolling game. None of that translated into going into the screen. And if we felt young and alive, right?
Yeah.
And then we got better and better and better. And at this point, it's like we're still progressing in those games, but it's much easier to know where the next step is because we've had 20 years of development. Along comes VR. We have gray hair now, but I feel like a kid. Because again, everything is up in the air, and all the rules we thought make sense are all of a sudden, we just have to throw them out and start over.
That's true. And I think now that we've gotten past the basic rules, we understand better how to make basic gameplay work, whether it's combat or puzzle solving. We can start to layer in all of those other design elements that we think are important for games. For example, in Stormland, we actually have a procedural system that's regenerating the Stormland every week. So the idea is that you as a player are going back over and over again to experience something completely different to find new challenges, and you're assigned, part of the challenges are that you're assigned these bounties to go up into the Stormland and work with friends to take them on every week. So this is a game that keeps going. But again, that was way too ambitious for us to even think about during the first few years of VR.
Yeah, getting multiplayer right. And in fact, let's start on some questions. And this one came up in my Twitter feed, so I'll just give it to you so we can answer more publicly. How does that work, single player, multiplayer in Stormland? Like, there are people that say, is it only a multiplayer game? I like single player games. Other people are like, it's only single player, I like multiplayer games. So what is the operation of that?
It's both. So we know that there are players who prefer to experience adventures on their own, and we absolutely do tune the game for that if you decide to move through the Stormland solo. But if you take on if you have a friend join you, the challenges become more difficult, and the loot you can earn is better, and you have to cooperate. What's interesting, too, about playing with a friend is this idea that in VR, it's your friend. The way that he or she moves is very specific to the person, unlike an avatar you might see in a regular console game where it's all generated based on what the animators came up with. I'm looking at Jason and seeing his head move the way I know it moves, or his hands, because he's holding touch controllers. And it imparts a personality that really is distinct for every single player.
Yeah, that's been an amazing experience for me, watching people that I know get into the headset, and without them saying anything, I can tell who they are because the way my head moves when I speak is different than the way your head moves. The way my body works is different than the way your body works, and you could just see that. And the other thing that's been really interesting, and I only do this to friends, is standing across from somebody in VR and then just heading straight at them. Right? So like imagine you're in a bar and you just go straight at somebody. They're going to look at you, and there's going to be this moment where deep in their brain, is this an attack? Is this something else? I got to do something. And they're going to move to the side, or they're going to get defensive, or whatever it is that their personality... Exactly the same thing happens in VR. So when you're in there with your friends in Stormland eventually, go straight at them and you'll see them go like this. Never would happen outside VR. They react as if you're in a real space.
It's a good personality test, right?
Yeah.
You can see what your friends really think of you.
Yeah, if they run and then hit something and fall down in VR, you can laugh at them.
Yeah.
Why don't we take questions?
Yeah. Let's see what we have here. We actually have a few. Okay, so first question is, hey, Ted, hey, Jason.
Hey.
This is from Brian Foster. How will the changing environment work? Is it procedural or set pieces? Well, actually, I answered that. It is procedural. We do build building blocks which are rearranged, and there are many, many different flavors as the weeks progress, and we continue to add content. Let's see. Lots of questions about Stormland. We need more questions about Oculus in general. Second question.
No, that's good. Stormland's fun. Yeah, that's great.
Once the story is completed, will there be an endgame content? Lots of us, the VR fans, have been waiting for a built-for-VR game into which we can sink hours and hours. There is actually, the idea here is that there is more and more content. So this is a story in which there are many mysteries to uncover, but our intent is to continue to provide lots of loot. And because it's cooperative and because you can exchange, you sort of have this cooperative/competitive existence with your friend, there are always, I think, there's incentive to go back and try to look for better stuff than your friends have.
Yeah, it is far more challenging to make an open-ended single-player game than a story-based ending single-player game.
Yeah.
So a lot of it's easy to make a never-ending multiplayer game. Take the simplest thing like ping pong. You can play ping pong endlessly as long as it doesn't bore you. So that's not hard. But when you're single player and you don't have other people in there and it doesn't change because the other player is a real player in real life, it's much harder to make something open-ended, which is why the earlier titles that came out for VR tended to focus on story. They could do it. Here's scene 1, scene 2, scene 3. We're done. The game is done. I can ship it. We're now getting into the second generation of VR content where we can tackle these procedural, never-ending titles and stuff like that. As you can see, it's exactly what the audience wants, along with story. There's nothing wrong with stories. That'll continue. But the audience wants this diversity, and VR is going to blossom into this diversity as we get the time to do games like this. So that's awesome.
Yeah, and I think this is, for us as developers, getting the feedback from players as they are playing through is really important, because then it helps us turn the knobs, tweak things, and figure out what it is that people are really responding to. Because, again, we're early in the VR life here, and we're still trying to figure out what it is that VR players really respond the best to.
Yeah. I am a devout Reddit/r/Oculus reader. I do not post because I don't want to move the conversation, but I read every comment that I can from every player. I go deep to see where people want VR to go. The future is clear to us, but how we get there is not. So when we hear from users what they want, it impacts what we do next. So please do get out there and say what you want.
And I have a question about that in just a second. I just want to answer one more that came up. Travis Fass asked, is everything in the game procedurally generated, or will there be certain key set pieces and story missions that are going to be more hand designed? Yes, not everything is procedurally generated. I think if you can have a purely procedurally generated game and that presents its own challenges, we do a lot of handcrafting of our content at Insomniac, and that's important to create something that we feel is unique, right? If everything is procedural, it's much harder to give it a specific style or flavor. Yep. But I want to go back to what you said about Reddit. What are some of the most, say, thought-provoking comments and questions you get when you're cruising through the lists?
It varies so widely. There's so much going on in VR, it's really hard to get your head wrapped around like all of the vectors of movement. I'll tell you one thing that really surprised Oculus writ large recently is that I started seeing more and more posts from people who were saying, I really wish there was a seated play mode, like I am now, seated as opposed to standing and walking around. And when we started working on VR, we assumed everybody would be standing, everybody would be doing various things. It turns out a lot of people, perfectly healthy people, would like at the end of a hard day of work, or whatever they're doing, to just sit down, but they appreciate the immersion of VR and everything else. So we didn't expect that, but now Oculus is fully aware of the fact that a lot of gamers who love VR also love playing seated, which seems contradictory, Not the case at all. They love it. So that's a good example of something where nobody at Oculus, when we launched Rift, thought that would be the case. It is the case. And it's a significant percentage of players who play seated a lot of the time.
And so are there specific games now on the store that you think are really well suited to seated gameplay?
Yeah, From Other Suns did a seated game mode. And it's really easy to walk around and do all the things you're doing in VR, but without standing up. And in fact, now the amazing thing is I see the constraints, how hard it's been to get where we're going. I fully understand that consumers only see the results. Does this work for me, right? And so after From Other Suns released that mode, keep in mind that games, even our early games, were a year to too long. So we kept releasing games and people were like, come on. I mean, you have it in From Other Suns. Why does this game not have a seated mode? We're like, we didn't even know that this was a thing. Now it's a thing. And now we have to look at all our future games and figure out how to get this thing to work. So I get both sides of that, right? The developers that are like, we never thought this was going to be a thing. We can't put it in at the end. But going forward, we are considering that. There are other people that swear by big rooms. Like, I want to be able to walk around this entire stage. And so we have to, we have to balance all of that. It's interesting.
I got to tell you, I get nervous about that. I mean, because in my office, when I'm playing Stormland, for example, there's a lot of climbing in Stormland. So you're moving your hands around. You're picking up guns. You're actually doing this, and I'm always I stand right next to my desk, so I have to be very careful not to knock things off of my desk. But the fact is, though, whether it's our game or other games, I am completely in the game. Right?
Yep.
It is something that I just forget about everything that's around me, which is why walking around is exciting and kind of terrifying at the same time. So
yep.
I do want a game that's going to inspire me to clear out of 15 feet in my living room and walk around.
Yep, but even with 15 feet, you always reach the end. And the challenge that we're starting to face now, we've shown our Santa Cruz prototype, which is an all-in-one headset with 6 degrees of freedom on your hand, on your hands and on your face. You can just start walking and just keep going. Right? It's stadium scale. It's
right.
As big as it is until you hit a wall. It's just going to kind of work for you. So we have to solve this problem. One of the things people don't realize about cables is, yes, you're connected to your PC, and yes, it would be better without the cable. But the cable does tell you which direction your PC's in and how far you're from it based on the weight that you feel in the cable. So as you're turning around and doing what you're doing, your brain is always locked on, okay, the cable tells me the PC's that way now. Once you get rid of that with standalone, you're completely out there. And people are pretty decent at understanding, I took a few steps this way, I took a few steps forward, I'm probably to the right and forward. The minute you have them warp to another room or go somewhere else, they've lost it. They have no idea where they are in space. And again, no cable to tell them where they're going.
Yeah.
So we have to solve the problem you're talking about. You have to be able to play in as big a room you're playing in and also be able to see the chair so that you don't hit it. And this is obviously more of what we're working on going forward. This reminds me, I started making games on the Apple II. It had none of the facilities that you needed to really make games. And everything had to be invented, right, from the ground up. We're doing the same thing with VR again.
Yeah, and I think you're talking about a really interesting inflection point for VR. It is when we solve that problem. Because, I mean, first of all, how many of you in this physical audience have played VR? A lot.
That's a lot.
Wow.
Awesome.
That's amazing. And I mean, you know what it's like, right? When you get into those environments, and that next step is not being knowing where you are at all times, and not being worried about the physical world around you. And that's sort of the for me at least, the tipping point where I am so immersed. I mean, I'm there.
Yep.
Well, I don't feel the cable.
And we have to balance all of these needs as we move forward. Like, people say, I want much higher res screen. We agree. Higher res screen would be much better. Then they say, I want wireless. And you're like, well, how are we going to transmit the higher res screen when we can barely transmit the screen that you have right now wirelessly, and it's clunky and the frame rate's not great and you can see the compression artifacts. Like, we could double the resolution of the screen, let's say. Okay. Now we have to send double the data to the headset. So everything's a balance. Be less expensive. We agree. It should be less expensive. We want new features. We agree. We want new features. Which one of these things do you choose? And we have this palette from which to choose going forward in VR, and it's been difficult for us to figure out what the next step is. So again, hearing it from consumers is the guiding light that we're going by. And what I hope is we're not just hearing the vocal minority, and there's a lot of people out there going, oh, actually, we want this other direction. We just don't yell it loudly in forums and the like, and we're missing the key direction. So please get out there and let us know what you want.
And speaking of which, does anybody in this audience have questions? Yes, you were right. And there's a gentleman who has a microphone who's going to come over to each of you. There he is. Okay, well, if you want to start over there.
That, and then
yes.
Yeah, hi, it's Jolyon Hennings here from Boxbet. Nausea is the big one. Certainly I've got a number of friends that play with VR, with movement. They do it for a week, whatever it is, and go, you know what, I can't even put it on my head anymore because I just feel sick. How are you getting over that?
Yeah, that's artificial locomotion, moving without moving. Everyone reacts to differently. It is definitely one of the challenges that we face with VR. And it's a very difficult one because it varies widely based on every unique person and every unique person at any given time. So there are many vectors we're attacking it with. This is the first generation of VR. So for example, better lenses, better screens, varifocal, just improving what you're seeing makes you feel more comfortable. There are other tricks we're learning, such as if you're pulling yourself along with your hands, which is one of your major ways of locomoting in Stormland, the fact that your hand is moving and that's moving you, your brain knows your hand's moving, your brain sees the movement, well, that's two things that it's getting feedback again, and your inner ear is arguing that it's not. So two is better than one-on-one, right? If just your eyes and your inner ear are fighting. There are other things we're working on. Fundamentally, the issue, if you will, is pretty easy to understand. It's a disconnect between what your inner ear is feeling, it's not moving, and your eyes, which think that they are moving. This is exactly the same, but the opposite of being in a boat under a deck where you're in the boat and your eyes don't see movement because you're moving with the boat, but your inner ear is rocking. And some people are like, let's go fishing. And some people say, I got to get off this boat. You're in the back of a car, you're reading a book. Book's not moving, your eyes say you're not moving, your inner ear on a windy street. This is exactly the same problem. Cars on hills exist, boats exist. Some people choose not to go out on boats in high seas. Some people choose to do different things, and they're just susceptible to it. But on average, we are doing a lot of work to cut away at the edges and make it more comfortable for everybody. That said, and just to make clear to anybody that's thinking about VR, even if you are motion sick in cars or boats and the like, so long as you are doing something where your head is moving and your eyes are getting the feedback it expects, which if I was doing this in VR right now would be an example of that, you will be fine. 99.9% of people are fine in Rift, looking under things, moving around, standing up, sitting down, that's all fine. The problem happens when you hit a controller and start moving and your inner ear says, I'm not moving, and your eye says you're moving. So there's still a massive amount of things you can do in VR without triggering the effect that you're speaking about, but we are whittling away at how many of those things do it. And perhaps you can talk about a couple of things you've done in Stormland.
Yeah, one of the, I mean, to your point about moving the camera, moving the player without you physically moving, some people are absolutely fine with that. And we acknowledge that, and there are ratings on the store that will help people understand, is this for more advanced players? Is this for somebody who's just getting in? We tried to do our best to keep the camera very level. So in slipstreaming, when you are moving across the clouds in Stormland, we keep the camera really even on this plane. You can actually create ramps where you can jump off, but that's just an optional thing to help you get up to higher cliffs. It's pretty neat. It's like skateboarding in VR. But if you prefer just to keep it nice, even, steady, you can choose to do that. So we try to accommodate both types of players.
And interestingly, one of the top 3 search terms on our platform is roller coaster. So even with all this, people take and on 3 Degrees of Freedom too, right? They take the worst possible scenario. They say, thumbs up, let's do that first. We had a question here, I want to make sure. Third person in, third row back, I guess.
Yeah, my question was in the same vein, except I was going to ask more about the development side at Insomniac. So I know research for VR is relatively new and it's like a big hot topic right now, and a lot is going into it. I was wondering, obviously at Oculus, that's one of your main focuses, but as a established game studio, how much of your team is like trying out these things and hopefully not getting sick doing them, but like, you know, figuring out what does and doesn't work, like the slipstream? Like how much of your team is researching that sort of stuff?
We don't set a certain number. We don't say, okay, everybody in the team has to play 3 new games per week. But we definitely know that everybody who's working on Stormland is a VR enthusiast. And so most of us have been playing games from the very beginning and figuring out, seeing what other developers are doing to tackle those challenges. Furthermore, we have spent a lot of time working with other developers. In fact, is that Chad DeZern in the back there? Wow. Chad DeZern is our Chief Creative Officer, runs our North Carolina studio, and is the originator of Stormland. So, Chad, if I'm saying anything, yeah.
The question you're asking is a good one, and I
Sorry,
do want
I just had to call out Chad's.
I do want to make sure to say the vast majority of people enjoy VR when they do it and do not get uncomfortable, especially if they locomote using teleportation or do something that's room-based, and there's plenty of stuff to do. Most studios I've found have a canary, like the canary in the coal mine, and that person is the one that gets most discomfort on boats, cars. Like they know that this person is kind of the first one to not necessarily feel that things are great. And they go back to that person over and over again, which is, of course, an awesome role to have if you're that person. And what we found is in a lot of studios, they break the canary because they get used to it, and it's fine, just like you get used to a lot of things that you do over. Not everyone will, but some people do get acclimatized, and they have to find another canary because that person is capable of dealing with very different things than they could the first time they tried VR.
And we are unfortunately out of time. But thank you guys for the questions. Thank you for those who send in questions via Facebook. And it's been a pleasure chatting with all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I'll take this with me.